Alright, so we're just going to try and tie up a couple loose ends from this little era of history. So we're going to look at a few of the political theorists that are working at this time. Two of them really in particular. And then we're going to look at what's going on in the Netherlands. So first, the two political theorists that we should be aware of that kind of affect at least England, and certainly probably to a larger extent Europe as a whole, are Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And Hobbes believes that people are really terrible. He has a real negative view of humanity and thinks that if left to their own devices, they would just kill each other. A very animalistic, negative view of the world, pessimistic view. And so because of this, he thinks that there needs to be a strong authoritarian government, and he thinks that that's really necessary. So that's his belief. But he also starts to float this idea that the government gets its authority not from God, but from what he calls an implicit social contract with those that it governs. So there's this idea that I am in charge of you because you allow me to be in charge of you, and my authority comes from you. Now, because Hobbes thought people were terrible, he generally does not believe, he doesn't believe at all, that they have a right to revolt. So he thinks that that ruling authority comes from the people, but that the people have no right to revolt. John Locke, on the other hand, he has kind of a different view of the role of government and what it means. And he believes that the government is set up to protect people's natural rights, and that those natural rights are life, liberty, and property, and that the government has a responsibility to protect all of those. If it does any more than that, or if it's not doing that, then it becomes a tyranny. And it's a tyranny where people then have a natural right to rebel. And so this is really important because it's Locke's theories that allow and kind of encourage the glorious revolution to happen, because people believe that they are living under a tyranny and they have a right to revolt. So those are Hobbes and Locke. Just floating those names out there. We'll come back to them certainly when we get to the Enlightenment, but I thought it was worth tossing out. Next, we'll just shift over to the Netherlands. And when we talk the Netherlands, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, the northern 7 provinces of the Netherlands that are independent at this time, this 17th century is really viewed as the golden age of the Netherlands. It is a time where science, art, and literature in the Netherlands is growing at a tremendous rate. This is their most kind of advanced that they are at this time. They are super wealthy. They have the highest standard of living in the world, or in Europe at the time. And their worldview really has a huge impact on the rest of the world, specifically the rest of Europe. And Europeans start to adopt the worldview of the Netherlands because of the influence that they have from developing such a wealth of culture and scientific knowledge. They are just completely dependent upon economics in order to be successful. And that's because they are a small nation. They don't have a lot of wealth. Or I'm sorry, they don't have a lot of people or land. They do have a lot of wealth. And so they may not be able to raise a traditional army, but they have so much money that they can hire mercenaries and be successful that way. So this is an important way for the country to develop. And essentially they figure out that they can become so wealthy by serving as middlemen in trade. And so their role is to facilitate trade. So you've got some spices that need to go from India to Europe. We'll have the Dutch merchant marine take care of that for you. You want to send things to the New World, we'll have the Dutch merchant marine take care of that. And so they become super wealthy. The other thing that's very helpful for them is they promote religious tolerance. They welcome all religions. And so we see when Jews and Muslims are being expelled from other countries, we see them flocking to the Netherlands. And they're bringing with them the skills that they have in the middle class skilled craftsman areas, but also then connections back to their home countries. It expands trade further between the Netherlands and those countries. So lots of talent and wealth is coming in as a result of this religious tolerance. Religious tolerance is super important in allowing for both economic and social growth. And of course, all of this leads to the Netherlands having the highest standard of living in Europe in the 17th century. So socially, that's what we've got going on, socially and economically. In terms of politics, the Netherlands, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, had 7 different provinces, and each of those had a wealthy oligarchy who ran it. So the merchant elite ran these provinces, and they had local, what were called estates, essentially parliaments, that would gather and take care of domestic policy. They would make policy decisions at their local level in their provinces. And then they would send representatives to a federal assembly called the States General. And that's representatives from all 7 of the provinces would gather, and they would handle foreign affairs. They don't have the authority to make any decisions as a sovereign nation. Any decisions that are made in the States General has to go back to the estates of each province and be ratified. And that process could take some time. So to help them out, the States General had a representative called a stadtholder in each province who would go and kind of lobby on behalf of the States General to make these laws happen. They don't have a king. They don't have a singular individual with much power. The House of Orange is probably the most powerful house at the time, and that's because they were the ones who led the revolt against Spain. So they kind of have the most respect. They sort of act as the first among equals. But nonetheless, they don't serve as any sort of king or monarch or any sort of like that. And this type of constitutional government is super unique, right? Each province kind of checks the power of the other, and they have this federal government that can make suggestions and decisions, but really requires the states or the provinces to help them out. And so what we see is this: it's a confederation of really strong provinces and a weak centralized government. And so that's what it looks like politically. One of the more unique features of the Netherlands is something called the Dutch East India Company, and it is created in 1602 as a joint stock company. And it's worth understanding this concept of a joint stock company. And what that means is that people, investors, can buy into the company. They can invest a certain amount of money, and based off the amount of money they invest, they receive a percentage of the profits every time they make a profit. And so this is a new idea, and it takes root in the Netherlands because there is so much money. But it also then allows those companies to gain a lot of initial capital. So the Dutch East India Company can take on all this money from these investors and promise, hey, we're going to make all these ships and go sail and make all these trades, and we're going to make so much money. And if you invest in us, you can get some of that money as well. And people are willing to buy in. And so this initial investment can allow the Dutch to build those ships to start that off. So that's how things are going. And that's the importance of this joint stock company. It's a way to get a lot more money a lot quicker to start your company than any other way. And the Dutch East India Company is a great investment. At one point, it's bringing in a 35% profit. So if you invest $100 a year, you're getting $35 back every year. And that's a huge profit margin, right? So after a few years, you've already made your investment, and you're making more and more and more as things go. This company really helps the Dutch take trade away from Portugal, and they become the dominant trade force and trade network down the coast of Africa, specifically in South Africa. They set up Cape Town down there, and then into India and Indonesia. What's also interesting about this company is that they serve as basically the imperialistic arm of the Dutch nation. They are the ones who are setting up colonies. They are the ones who are fighting the wars. The Dutch East India Company has the ability to print their own money and have their own private army. And at one point, they have a private army of like 100,000 men, spread throughout the globe, of course. But that gives you a sense of how much money this company is bringing in, and how much important trade and forts and trade outposts they need to defend. So that's the Dutch East India Company. That's a really unique company in history and super important. And then the last thing we'll talk about a little bit is this creates competition between the Dutch and England, and it leads to what are called the Anglo-Dutch Wars. This economic competition eventually leads to war because both of them are relatively small European nations Britain's an island nation. The Dutch are a small nation tucked away in kind of the northern part. But they both have really extensive colonies overseas that they need to defend and keep supported and keep the money flowing to them. And so these nations engage first in economic warfare. Specifically, Britain passes what's known as the Navigation Acts in 1651, which says that any goods traded to England have to be traded on British ships. And that's just a way for them to kind of apply mercantilist theories in action. So mercantilism says that there's a limited amount of resources in the world, and government should work to should make economic policies to acquire as much of that as possible. And so they do that by keeping the money flowing to shipping companies in the British Empire rather than shipping companies in other countries. And so this economic warfare begins in 1651, but it eventually breaks out into full Anglo-Dutch Wars, three different ones in the 1600s. From 1652, they're 2 years each for every 10 years, essentially. And these wars generally end in draws. Not a whole lot happen, but they're fighting for control of trade routes and colonies. They're kind of poaching each other's ships on these trade routes, and it's pretty intense because both of these countries are completely dependent on their navies and their overseas empires in order to support themselves as a powerhouse in Europe. And so that's kind of the tie between the English and the Dutch, and that is the Dutch nation. Although they are super small, they are incredibly wealthy, and during the 1600s, they are one of the most important countries in Europe because of their wealth. They start to suffer economic downturn in the late 1600s, but throughout the 1600s, they are an incredibly important and powerful nation.